Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, same to you. Sing it with all your heart and soul and see everyone right up the pole. Mademoiselle from Armentières. Standing on Knox from Glasgow town, he put on his kilt one day, down with a briny tray, merry and bright and gay.
Thank you very much, and many thanks to Gary and Steve and the people who invited me to come here. It is a tremendous honour. As you stated, this lecture is not directly about the history of the war. This is a lecture about my attempt to write a history of the war. It is striking that the most famous fatality of a war that killed some 12 million people is a fictional character. This casualty, of course, is Paul Baumer, the protagonist of Éric Maria Remarque's novel, known to us by its English translated title, All Quiet on the Western Front. Due to the massive global dissemination of first the book and then the film, Baumer's death has a unique place in global memory. It's been estimated, incidentally, that something in the region of 1 billion people have seen the film of All Quiet on the Western Front, taking into account its continual repetition on television channels across the world. In the novel, there is no detail of Baumer's death, simply the flat statement that he was killed on a day towards the end of the war when it was reported that there was no news from the West or from the Western Front. It is the American film adaptation that provides the detail, using an image of a butterfly resting on a skull, which is in the book, to inspire a suitable ending for the film. And in the film, Baumer is shot by a French sniper whilst reaching for a butterfly. This powerful image supersedes the novel to the extent that even those who know the book well tend to imagine Baumer's death in this way, even though it is not in the book. So there are two levels of textual overlay at work: a novel superimposed on the war and a film adapting the novel. There is more, though. Although Baumer is often taken to be a self-portrait by the author, Baumer's war experience in the novel bears little resemblance to Remarque's own experience of the war. And even in this final still, there is a further removal. The hand reaching for the butterfly is not the hand of the actor who plays Baumer, Lou Ayres, but that of the director of the film, Lewis Milestone. This is his cameo, this is his auteur statement of his connection with this final scene. Timing is important. The novel was published in 1928, so coinciding with the run-up to the 10th anniversary of the armistice, which, through the mechanism of commemorative rituals in the victorious nations, was starting to be thought of as the end of the war. But the American film appears in 1930, in the midst of the onset of the Great Depression, and its subsequent global release into a world plunged into economic crisis helped reinforce the idea, demonstrated in the film, that the war had utterly failed to fulfill the promise of a better world that had been the central theme of Wilsonian propaganda during the war. Now, there is no more frequently repeated statement in journalism and indeed in university admission statements from prospective students than history is written by the winners. Yet, interestingly, when it comes to the history of war, and even more the imaginative literature of war, the voice of the defeated is often the loudest. From Thucydides to Clarendon, and from Germinal to Gone with the Wind, and indeed on to Apocalypse Now and Platoon, defeat seems to produce more resonant, if not automatically better art. it is not the least of the ironies of the war that it was a German soldier author who managed to define the war most effectively for the English-speaking world, even after his work was banned and burnt in the fatherland he was forced to flee. I am of a generation of historians that experienced the full force of the linguistic turn in historical studies. This emphasised the idea that the language that describes the world does not equate with the world itself, and led on to the view that historians' descriptions of the past are not and cannot be recreations of that past, but are literary constructions that represent the past utilising certain tropes which are recognisably drawn from other literary genres. Or, to put it in a provocative and frequently misunderstood fashion, that our histories are fictions. A lot of historians balk at this, and the implication that we are primarily storytellers and that there may be no real criteria for distinguishing between truth and falsehood in our narratives. Historians are indeed rightly fond of pointing out that even if absolute truth is hard to establish, demolishing falsehoods on the basis of evidence has been the bread and butter of the profession for at least 200 years. Furthermore, a good deal of what professional historians do is not narration, but more analogous to the presentation of research findings in the sciences, both social and physical. And indeed, attempts to apply literary critical techniques to those fields have, in my view, proved less than convincing. Nevertheless, there is a virtue in at least occasionally reminding ourselves that our predecessors and ourselves have indeed often been consciously telling stories about the past, and that amongst the vast, although certainly not infinite number of stories we can tell without violating the available evidence, there will and indeed must be many decisions of selection and omission which are in turn being made in light of fundamental decisions about the narrative we are writing itself. Sometimes, of course, the shape of the narrative will be determined by clearly political and partisan decisions, ones based on present concerns, if you like, the bias beloved of A-level mark schemes. But at least as often, a new historical narrative will be driven by a desire to communicate a sense of the cumulative weight of recent research, an attempt to get to a readership, academic or popular, in a way that will make them view events which they believe themselves to be familiar with in a new way. And a centenary is an obvious excuse for such a fresh look, and this was indeed a major impetus for my book. Finally, in a way that is almost entirely overlooked in writing about historiography, there are always motives that are contingent and pragmatic. I undertook the work in part because I had foolishly suggested in a review article of a number of very, very large books about the First World War that there was room for a few more short histories of the war. And as a result of writing this, I was approached by Oxford University Press to contribute to a format that I found interesting and gave me an opportunity to put on paper some of the things that I thought I had learned from the reading involved in 15 years of teaching. So this book was not driven primarily by my own archival research, although those familiar with my work will find some occasional references to it. This work is fundamentally an interpretative synthesis, drawing on several hundred scholarly studies from the last 40 or so years, not to mention innumerable conversations with colleagues and students who work on the war. Quite often, the writing was structured around an attempt to venture an answer to questions that I had found frequently emerging from classes and from tutorials. The course I teach in Oxford is a comparative history of the war, and this is partly a legacy of my own experience in Cambridge as a doctoral student of J. Winter. So although my principal speciality is British history, I was uncomfortably aware that the centenary was likely to be not simply British-centred, but possibly outright Anglo-centric. Having already hopefully made some contributions to both the scholarly and popular knowledge of the British experience of the war, I wanted to put that experience back into the wider frame, because without that framework, much of the discussion can become painfully parochial. And indeed, I do think to a certain extent so far this year, that fear has been borne out. Of course, new ways of looking at events can generate hostility, and the motives of those who are pursuing a clearly political purpose and those who are trying to communicate new information can become inextricably confused. In Alan Bennett's play The History Boys, the cynical smart aleck teacher Irwin presents to his young charges a series of perverse statements drawn from revisionist work on the First World War by Niall Ferguson. The audience is supposed to realise that these challenges to receive wisdom are obviously preposterous and aimed only to shock. But in this scene, Bennett indiscriminately mixed together statements from Ferguson which were genuinely controversial and indeed probably were aimed primarily to shock, and other statements which represented a widespread emerging scholarly consensus amongst the specialists on the war, but which differed from the version of the First World War that Alan Bennett had been brought up with. And indeed, the implication of Bennett's position was that fundamentally the truth of the past is already known and that there is no point in new research or new narratives. Rather, that history is simply about the passing on of established wisdom about events. And it's interesting, I mean, Ferguson responded to this somewhat on these lines, but actually a number of historians who I think would clearly have been identified as left-leaning historians made similar critical points about what Bennett had done in that passage. Now, that leads me by an indirect route back to All Quiet, because, in my view, it is this work of fiction which above all establishes the narrative understanding of the First World War in the 20th century. And in that sense, establishes what we might say as the standard historical wisdom about the war. The core propositions of the novel, if you can talk of a novel having core propositions, but I think you can in this case, the core propositions of the novel are that the younger generation are deceived by the older generation into fighting a war with no real purpose, that youth undergoes a journey from innocence to disillusion, that civilians understand nothing of the real war, that the war is a succession of meaningless fights for ground of no significance in the trenches of France and Flanders, and at the end all the soldiers die. And that, in a sense, is a summary of All Quiet on the Western Front. This fundamental structure, which is incidentally recreated almost perfectly in the 1990s television comedy Blackadder Goes Forth, and I should at this point state for the record that I am an enormous fan of Blackadder Goes Forth. I can recite huge chunks of it, although I won't do so now, and my love for it was finally further reinforced by Michael Gove being critical of it, which immediately reinforced my view that it was right to love it. I also know that Gary's a fan, and used to do a rather good double act on it, didn't you? Anyway, but the structure of All Quiet on the Western Front is, in a comedic form, perfectly reproduced in Blackadder Goes Forth. But it's also the structure that underpins the enormously influential critical work of the late American literary critic Paul Fussell, The Great War and Modern Memory. For Fussell, this ironic plot is the natural and true representation of this and any industrial war. All ideals and indeed all purpose collapses to nothing in the face of the Moloch war machine that simply consumes everyone and everything. and anyone who says different is a propagandist, a knave, or a fool. But it is my belief that Fussell, to a large extent, reverses the causality. It is my contention that the key works of fiction, and particularly All Quiet, constructed this particular understanding of the war. So, ironic fiction creates the truth of an ironic war, which is then used to judge the correctness of future writing about the war, and not only fictional representations, but also historical ones. Therefore, I felt that the central challenge I faced in writing my book was deciding how to react to this. I did not want to simply replicate the tropes of a war of futility, but neither did I want to simply write a negation of that view, and I cannot stress that strongly enough. In other words, I am not simply, as it were, writing the anti-All Quiet on the Western Front. I wanted somehow to capture some of my own ambivalence, and an ambivalence which grew ever stronger in the writing. I did not want to write a story which is only one of horror and misery, but I at the same time did not want to deny that it is a story of horror and misery. Similarly, politically and militarily, this was a war that genuinely had victors and vanquished, and the difference between them really mattered. But understanding this and writing about this does not have to become simply a celebration of victory. So, now the book is done. There are some hardline postmodernist literary critics who would deny any significance to authorial intent and would insist that the only meanings of a text are those that are generated by the reader. On the off chance that they are right, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that hardly anyone has yet read the book, and the fact that I have myself been rereading it. So, as at this moment I am more or less the only reader, I'm going to make some speculations about what the author was up to. But I will make one observation which I think is unavoidably based on the privileged knowledge of the writer. The order in which decisions are taken by the writer frequently do not correspond at all with the order in which they appear in the text. The most blatant example of this is the title of the book. Through most of the writing process, the book existed under the working title Armageddon. Now, the imagery of the war as the last battle and harbinger of the millennium was quite widespread at the time. But I was never very comfortable with a title that was frankly a bit cliched. It is also frequently the case that you need to have the text largely finished before you can really be sure what the title ought to be. And so when Max Hastings decided to use the title Armageddon for his book on the Second World War, it was actually a bit of a relief because it provided me with a rationale to approach Oxford University Press to change away from that title. I honestly can't quite remember how the alternative title, which I finally used, A War of Peoples, came to me. I'd long been fascinated by H.G. Wells using the term the People's War in August 1914, a contemporary perspective that had largely been forgotten, and indeed I remember very much enjoying telling Josie Harris in Oxford that the first usage of the term the People's War was H.G. Wells in August 1914, and it was not originally a term used of the Second World War. But in the end, I think the decisive thing was reflecting on an earlier quote by Moltke the Elder, in which he stated that the wars of the future would be Volkskrieg rather than cabinet wars. People's wars, wars of people. This idea of a war of peoples then embraces the idea of a war which involved the wider population in new ways and that was shaped in turn by the actions and aspirations of a plurality of peoples. This was a war that engaged the populace, but one that was only problematically popular. And of course, the principal consequences of the war was the overthrow of dynastic empires in what was, I would argue, perhaps one of the great revolutions of world history, of which the Russian revolutions of both February and October are only a part. At the same time, and I probably should have had a War of Peoples question mark, but I've used that trick before. At the same time, the narrative I had written showed that Moltke was only partly right. The First World War, in fact, retained many elements of cabinet war. The war was, in reality, a hybrid in which traditional high political manoeuvres were increasingly forced to take into account popular reactions, but didn't stop in that sense. And the idea of a war of peoples perhaps also allowed me to give some sense of its revolutionary scope, whilst at the same time providing some distance from what I believe to be the misleading concept of total war, which I think has been frequently misapplied to the First World War. So that's where the title came from. If the title was one of the last decisions, the first big narrative decision was chronology. Where to start, where to finish. And I chose to begin the narrative with the beginning of hostilities between Serbia and the Habsburg Empire on the 28th of July, and then to provide a chronological, sequential narrative of the war. And this narrative is relatively short, 150 pages divided into 5 chapters of roughly equal length. Each of these chapters covers a year beginning and ending in the middle of the summer. And this means, of course, that the last chapter follows the story from the failure of the Great German Offensive and the beginning of the general counter-offensive, right the way through the armistices, actually. What's the plural of armistice? Armistice, I don't know. The armistices of the autumn of 1918, right the way through to the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles by Britain, France, and Germany in the summer of 1919. In other words, in this narrative, it is the Paris Peace Conference rather than the armistice which is the climax to the story. Any decision of this kind comes at a price. Now, the price I was happy to pay was not starting my book with a prolonged discussion of the origins of the war. It is my belief that most of these discussions slip into an overly long argument about guilty parties, and that relatively little new has been discovered in the last 50 years. I was also aware that 2013-14 would see a rush of new books on the subject, and that anything I wrote would run the risk of seeming dated. Now, although those of you in the audience who've read Chris Clark or Sean McKeekin may be surprised at this, all I really do in a couple of cursory comments is suggest that the primary responsibility of the war rests in military circles in Vienna and Berlin. And I do so because I believe that this remains the expert consensus. Not, I should say, that a historical consensus is automatically right, but it would be premature to ignore the fact that that consensus is still holding. And as yet, the lack of much new evidence on this subject means that the case for revising it has not at all convinced me. Besides, even without a discussion of the origins of the war, the chapter for 1914-15 is already creaking a bit under its own weight. Hugh Strawn, in his magisterial and still unfinished 3-part history, managed to write some 400 pages on the last 4 months of 1914 alone. And this was without covering the spring offensives of 1915, the Dardanelles campaign, the Italian entry into the war, and the other things that I wish to include in my 30 or so pages for the first chronological year. When writing, I left this 1914-15 chapter until I had begun all the others, and had indeed finished the 1915-1916 one. I was daunted by it, and if I'm honest, I'm still not entirely happy with it. My biggest single worry is that I have assigned just over 1 page to the Armenian genocide. My main judgment was that if I could not really treat it fully, then I would treat it briefly and with quite a lot of attention to precise wording. But I have to say, I have since reconsidered this, and it is high on my list for rethinking if there is a second edition. But the losses in this slightly difficult first chapter, I think, have been matched by gains elsewhere. A chapter structure that brings the USA into the war halfway through the middle chapter of the book, rather than as being something of a deus ex machina at the end, does, I think, change the way that the story of the war works. So does separating the Russian February Revolution from the October one. Placing the discussion of the expansion of armaments production in Britain, France and Russia in the same chapter as the discussion of the battles of the spring and summer of 1916 creates a very clear linkage, and so does placing together the German sense of crisis in the autumn of 1916 with the move towards U-boat warfare, or unrestricted U-boat warfare, I should more accurately say. The effective start points of the chapters, as I say, the Austrian bombardment of Belgrade, the failure of the German diplomatic approaches to Russia in August 1915, the dismissal of Falkenhayn and the appointment of the Third German High Command in August 1916, the Papal and Socialist peace initiatives in August 1917, and the start of the great Allied counter-offensive in the West, the 100 Days in August 1918, I believe allows a natural unfolding of the story of the subsequent year after these start points. Above all, the structure I've chosen allows a proper amount of weight in the narrative to the end of the war, which in many other short accounts I feel is treated in a cursory fashion. The complex causalities of the defeats of the Central Powers could be given some real consideration, as could the dilemmas of peacemaking for the victorious alliance. It is my suspicion that one reason why victory and defeat have often played such a small role in British narratives of the war is the disproportionate amount of weight in those narratives usually given to the start of the war compared to its end. Spending a proper amount of pages on the defeat of the Central Powers restores this defeat to its proper importance in the story of the war. And beyond this was a final decision. The story is, as I say, brought to a conclusion in the late summer of 1919, or in some ways a non-conclusion. I end with Clemenceau describing the emerging peace as fraught with possibilities, because I believe it was. One of the strangest things in the writing about the First World War is that the very same historians who tend to stress the contingency of the outbreak of the war are usually ferociously determinist about its consequences. Yet, it is my conviction that the subsequent catastrophes of the 20th century do not follow automatically from the war, or even from the Paris Peace Conference. And it is also, I think, worth remembering that many of the things that come out of the war which reshape the global order do so in more or less a positive fashion in what Erez Manela has famously described as the Wilsonian moment. Which is a useful reminder that I faced geographical challenges alongside the chronological. The First World War was fought predominantly in Europe by global powers, but throughout the conflict there were theatres of operations that ranged much further. The Caucasus and Mesopotamia, Palestine and East Africa were the scenes of major campaigns, and the conflict on occasion stretched from the Falkland Islands to Mali and on to Singapore and Tsingtao. Soldiers and nurses were recruited from New Zealand and British Columbia. Vital supplies came from Uruguay and from Baltimore. The narrative needed to reflect this, but at the same time recognise the real primacy of Europe in the story. And in doing so, I felt it needed to recognise that this was a genuinely pan-European story, rather than one of the Western Front and sideshows. The conflicts along the Italian border, in the Balkans and in Poland, Ukraine and the Baltic states were important to the outcome of the war. I also felt that giving these often dramatic campaigns their due was important in itself. Now, this was a challenge. My own linguistic limitations meant that I could not tackle the literature of these fronts as effectively as I could the literature of the Western powers. And they have, on the whole, been neglected in the English language historiography, although I think this is starting to change. But I felt it needed to be done. Now, moving the narrative around geographically within a chronological framework, I found helped bring out the often close connections between campaigns in different theatres. The way, for example, in which the Battle of Verdun, the Austrian attack on Italy through the Alps, the Brusilov offensive and then the Battle of the Somme were linked in the spring and summer of 1916, this makes more sense to me than having a series of chapters on the campaigns in different theatres, which is the way I think it's usually done in the narratives. Now, in terms of content, approximately half of the 150 pages of this core narrative cover military, and by military, including naval operations. This was a difficult decision for me, as I am not and do not claim to be a military historian. But there were three reasons for doing this. The first was a desire to communicate some of the things that I have learned from the often excellent recent works on the military history of the war. The second was, to some extent, as hinted before, to alter the balance of attention. Often in Anglophone historical overviews, the battles and campaigns in which the British were involved are covered in far greater depth than those in which they were not. And the third reason was to restore to these military operations a sense of their consequentiality. Too often narratives of the war move from the opening mobile campaigns to a description of 3 years of trench stalemate in the West and an implication that these battles in their pointlessness are simply demonstrations of the boneheaded stupidity of high command. And by contrast, the huge mobile operations of the Eastern Front in 1915 to 1917 usually received little attention, although in my view, by contrast, Gallipoli has often been given a disproportionate role. The massive cataclysmic struggle of 1918 in the Western Front has, I think, similarly been overshadowed and sometimes treated as an afterthought, again at the expense of the concept of battles as being in any way decisive. But even the Western Front battles of 1915 to 17, which result in little territory changing hands, were hugely politically and economically consequential. And indeed, they were sometimes much more so in this respect than the allegedly decisive battles in more mobile wars. So, I have a shot at doing the military history of the war, and I say this with some embarrassment with some of my colleagues in this room. I'm also going to, at this point, fess up to two errors that I have already spotted in the published text, just to indicate that I am aware of them before everybody writes in. The first is I make a reference to James Grierson, to John Grierson as the commander of 2nd Corps BEF in 1914. And as I've just indicated, what happened there is I refer to John Grierson rather than James Grierson. I am aware of this. I did email OUP. I got it to them a bit late for them to correct it in the printed thing, and nobody does errata slips anymore. So consider this one a verbal errata slip. It should be James Grierson. My explanation for this is I spend quite a lot of time teaching a course on War and Reconstruction 1939-45, and of course John Grierson is the doyen of the documentary film movement, and that's, I think, why I slipped and had John rather than James. The other one, and I know that there are probably, I suspect 2 or 3 of the people in this audience are probably 2 of the 3 people who notice it and would actually call me on it. I do at one point refer to the German 155mm Morse or howitzer. I did, of course, mean 150mm, not 155mm. And again, I'm aware that I made that slip. I'm not sure it matters enormously, but that is the Jack Johnson, isn't it? It's the 4.7. Is the 155, I think. Yeah. So I am aware that that slip occurred. But all I can do really is apologise. There will be these are the known ones. There are also the unknown unknowns in there, which I'm cringing in expectation of hearing about. Anyway, that's my possibly cack-handed attempt to do the military history of the First World War. The perceived need to seriously address the military history of the war cut against another of the objectives I set myself, which was to genuinely restore women to the story of the war. Although there has been a lot of monographic work on women in the First World War, relatively little of it, in my opinion, has yet made its way into the existing narrative histories of the war. Now, there are some good reasons for this. The world of military, diplomatic, and political decision-making in the early 20th century is almost entirely male. Gender history can have a field day in examining the way concepts of manliness impacted on these spheres, but women as significant individual agents in these areas are largely absent. And perhaps only 2 women would, and then arguably, make it into that military, diplomatic, and political narrative. And I'd say that would be the Tsarina Alexandra and Rosa Luxemburg. Fortunately, and in my, what's to some degree my more real field, social, cultural, and economic history, fortunately in the social, cultural, and economic history of the war, individual women do loom larger, and there is an increasing realisation that women's collective agency mattered. More generally, the presence of women was crucial in order to make it clear that the war of the home front was as much the real war as that of the trenches. Women, and indeed children and civilian men, also experienced a war in these years. So, in the book, I have tried to include some of the stories. Some are reasonably, maybe even very familiar, such as those of Edith Cavell and Margareta Zeller, also known as Mata Hari. Some are moderately well known, such as those of Clara Zetkin or Sylvia Pankhurst or Constance Markiewicz. And some are not well known at all, such as that of the Romanian soldier Ekaterina Teodoru or the American dissident Agnes Smedley. For me, it is striking that in 1915, H.G. Wells speculated that the peace ship organised by the Hungarian feminist Rosika Schwimmer would be one of the few things remembered about the war at its centenary. And I think it's good to be reminded of it now that it's been almost entirely forgotten. Another thing that I wanted to bring to this narrative was a somewhat different and less insular view of the cultural history of the war. And so, although Rupert Brooke, Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen get name-checked, I was ultimately more interested in names and things which are now well known amongst the cultural historians of the war, which are not yet standard parts of the normal English language narratives. For example, the protest art of the Dadaists of Cabaret Voltaire, the adaptation of Cubism as camouflage in the French army, or the scandal surrounding the modernist ballet Parade in 1917. My dead poets find room for other, less known, but I think equally interested voices, such as the Irishman Francis Ledwidge, the Slav Vladislav Dis, and the German Gerrit Engelt. And of course, a big role for Guillaume Apollinaire. And finally, I wanted to give some attention, at least, to the economic history of the conflict. This was a difficult challenge, as years of experience with Oxford history undergraduates has taught me that many of them panic at the sight of numbers. And this certainly makes me question the wisdom of appointing one of them as Chancellor of the Exchequer. I tried to keep the numbers to a minimum and to use them in clear service of the written argument. I eschewed tables and graphs despite my own liking for them. And once again, this is something I may revisit if there is a second edition. And indeed, my chair of faculty, the distinguished economic historian Jane Humphreys, was prodding me about this at the book launch. Again, in choosing not to separate out the various dimensions of the war into thematic chapters, I realise that I am making a substantial demand on the reader and risking the book becoming a chronicle of one damn thing after another. But I hope that by refusing to artificially break apart things which in reality were closely independent, it ultimately makes the war more comprehensible. Now, bracketing this 150-page central narrative are introductions to sources and to the historiography. And in a book, and this is the terrible admissions moment, in a book without scholarly footnotes, these were the main opportunity to show my workings and to introduce the non-specialist reader to the scholarship on the subject. At the start, I consider a number of sources: an American film, All Quiet, a passage from the memoir of a German general, Falkenhayn's so-called Christmas Memorandum, a French soldier's song, the Chanson de Crayon, a statistical table of food supplies to St. Petersburg, a photograph of an Italian bomber at an aviation museum taken from a website, and the statue of Edith Cavell outside the National Portrait Gallery. In each case, the intention was to indicate the sheer scale of available evidence. And by the way, I'm married to an ancient historian, and I always feel that we're sort of operating, although we're both in some respects are doing the same thing, the difference between being an ancient and a 20th century historian is completely extraordinary in that they, in a sense, have to work the few sources they have extraordinarily intensely, whereas we have to try and make sense of this massive barrage of possible information. In each case, the intention was to indicate the sheer scale of the available evidence, but also the need to actively interpret it. It doesn't just speak for itself, in fact. And at the end, I consider the historiography of the war in a series of sections, each of which starts with a key text published since 1960, and then follows through with books that engage with the themes that that work opened up. And again, I will state quite straightforwardly, in some respects, this is designed to be of service to undergraduate students seeking to navigate their way through the arguments and controversies of the field. But I also hope that it will serve as an acknowledgement of the fact that a book like this is inevitably indebted to a great body of scholarly research. And it only occurred to me when I was talking to Gary over coffee that he's the only person who gets 4 entries. Some of the decisions taken in the book will undoubtedly provoke criticism. Some will hate the neglect of the origins of the war. I have dedicated more pages to the military narrative, to the discussion of the operations of the French army than to those of the British army, and as much to the narrative of operations away from the Western Front as from those on it. And this will doubtless play poorly with some. At the same time, I do not hide or minimise the strikes and mutinies that occurred during the war, but I also make it clear that the idea that the war was ended I also make it clear that the war was ended because one side was defeated, and that the war was not ended by a mass anti-war popular uprising on all sides. This simply doesn't work as an interpretation. Furthermore, the uprisings against the war in Russia, and to some extent in Germany, did not in fact deliver peace, but rather an intensified civil conflict. There are, I think, always some readers of popular histories who take comfort in having reaffirmed the facts and opinions with which they are already most familiar, as even a cursory examination of reviews on books on Amazon will demonstrate. So the ambition of my book to tell people things that they do not already know will undoubtedly provoke negative comment from some. And indeed, in some ways, the book is perhaps ultimately not designed for those who are already deeply knowledgeable, but rather to serve as an introduction to those who are interested. Although I hope that those who are deeply knowledgeable in some areas will still find use in it in areas in which they are less knowledgeable, at least as an introduction to thinking about things in a slightly different way. Others will find this book too conservative, with insufficient consideration of cutting-edge approaches to the writing of history in gender, ethnicity, emotion, the history of the senses, technology, or the environment. I do think that this is potentially a more interesting criticism, and I would admit that I have stayed a little on the conventional side to avoid alienating my imagined general reader, and in the need of sustaining a narrative drive. But perhaps the thing that will irritate most of all is a failure to sit in judgment on the war, an evasion of a flat statement of whether it was, to quote those great satirical historiographers and indeed First World War veterans, Sellers and Yateman, whether the war was a good thing or a bad thing. In some ways, of course, I believe the answer is obvious. The death, maiming and bereavement of millions in and of itself can only be bad, almost unimaginably so. Whether this enormity of suffering could possibly achieve any positive results that were not disproportionately trivial by comparison is difficult to imagine. But, and this is where I would depart from some people on this, I would suggest similar considerations apply to all wars. So, endings are difficult, and even if I push back against milestones, I cannot deny its power. As I said, in the narrative section, it was that most vilified and misunderstood of the victors, Georges Clemenceau, who is given the last word in addressing the National Assembly during the debate on the ratification of the Versailles Treaty, when Clemenceau stated that the treaty was, and I'll mention this again, a set of possibilities, and that what followed would depend on how his successors dealt with those possibilities. By contrast, of course, Marshal Foch had stated that the treaty was not a peace, but a 20-year truce. And these words have often been taken as prescient. But of course, what Foch had meant by this was emphatically not that the peace had been too vengeful, not that it had been a Carthaginian peace, but rather that it hadn't been, that it had been far too lenient. Foch did not object in the slightest to the grievances of Germany being produced by the peace treaty, but rather he objected to the fact that in his judgment, Germany had been left with the means to act upon its grievances. On balance, I side with Clemenceau more than I do with Foch, and indeed from the other angle, more than I do with John Maynard Keynes. But in stopping the story in the summer of 1919 with a piece of possibilities, I refuse the inevitability of what followed. But, and I'm going around another series of qualifications, that's what academics do, I'm also very aware that certain things in reality did follow, and that there is room for an alternative ending which returns once more to the perspective of the vanquished, and not those vanquished in simply a national sense. So the very, very last word of the book is my dedication of the book to my 5-year-old son, something that will not surprise anyone who knows me. It's an obsessive subject to conversation. The war played a vital role in creating the world I grew up in, and its last resonances, I believe, will still be echoing out in the world that Theo grows up in. But what parenthood has done to me as a historian, as an author, it has made me aware of the unbearable, or the almost unbearable pain which is at the heart of the war. I think more and more now of Rudyard Kipling desperately trying and failing to find out what happened to his boy Jack. And this is since finishing the book when I really became aware of it, I now think perhaps above all of the sketch by the German artist Katja Kollwitz of her son Peter, who was killed in 1914, and of her grandson, also named Peter, who was killed in action in 1942. And in one of Kollwitz's last works, she drew them both as toddlers folded in her arms and entitled the sketch, "You Must Not Grind the Seed Corn." A quote from Goethe that she had first used in an angry response in the socialist newspaper Vorwärts in 1918 to a call for German youth to fight to the end. And whatever else I may think about the multiple possible meanings of this war, this sketch brings me always to the point of tears. I thank you.
had no chance of shining Cupid's lamp until the day the college spied a stranger in the camp. Ooh, Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, same to you. Sing it with all your heart and soul and see everyone right under the pole. Mademoiselle from Armentières. Up in his aeroplane one night when Robinson for the flight, everything all right, beautiful moonlight night, circled around the moon a while its wonders to explore, looping the loop above the clouds and what do you think he saw? Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, time to you. Sing it with all your heart and soul and see everyone right up the pole. Mademoiselle from Armentières.